Hey everybody, it's your AP Biology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we are continuing our 7th unit on natural selection in this class by getting into topic 7.12, which is variations in populations. This first bullet point that I put down here is that genetic variation in a population makes natural selection possible. Okay, natural selection, as we know from way back in the beginning of the unit, it really can't happen without there being some genetic differences within individuals in a population, right? So one trait can't possibly be more advantageous than other traits if everybody's traits are exactly the same in a population, right? So in order for any kind of natural selection to exist where the environment selects the traits that are going to be good enough to survive and reproduce and pass down that trait to the next generation, there needs to be differences in traits and thus genetic variation. And here's something that we want to get into today. We're going to make really one big point in this video today, and this has to do with it here. How varied a population is affects its population dynamics, and I put in parentheses how much the population increases or decreases. Okay, so I have 3 different species of animals up here. We have 2 birds and a mammal. We have a lesser prairie chicken, which is legit. It's a wild chicken that used to live in prairies back when those were still a thing in North America, and it wasn't replaced by farmland, which we'll actually talk about in a little bit as well. So these are super endangered. The California condor is a threatened species. It used to be very endangered as well. They're on the comeback a little bit as far as their population. And cheetahs are also endangered. They might be endangered, they might be threatened, but either way, their population is not as good as it should be. And what the similarity between all 3 of these animals is not just that they've undergone massive habitat loss and population loss under the iron grip of human beings. What happened to them is that they all underwent a bottleneck effect. Okay, so we talked about bottleneck effect way back in topic 7.4 when we were discussing the 5 different ways that genes can change or that evolution can occur, right? So we got natural selection, gene flow, mutation, sexual selection, and genetic drift, right? So all 3 of these species and their populations underwent genetic drift, or they underwent a bottleneck effect, where there was a lot, it was a wide variety, a wide gene pool, and then it underwent some kind of event that it narrowed down the population quite a bit, and that's called a bottleneck effect. And when that happens to a species, okay, the gene pool becomes very, very small, and whatever's left of that population, the entire gene pool is represented by those genes left in the bottleneck. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is that not only do these 3 species not have many numbers, but the numbers that they do have are all very related to each other. Okay, there's not a lot of genetic variation at all. So most of the cheetahs, the prairie chickens, and especially the condors, the California condors that you're going to see out in the wild are most likely inbred. They're related to each other. Okay, the entire California condor population is descended from 14 survivors of the bottleneck. Okay, so they're very related to each other, and that means that there's going to be very, very little genetic variation within these populations. If they're all related to one another, they all have the same genes, relatively speaking. Okay, and that's a problem. That is a huge problem. As I said on the previous page, how varied a population is affects its population dynamics, how much it increases or decreases. So these 3 populations, because they have very little genetic variation, are at risk. They are at risk for an environmental catastrophe, really. So a disruption in the environment, that's what triggers natural selection. Any kind of change in the environment, species that are better adapted, have traits that make them better adapted than others, are going to survive and reproduce, right? But like I said, if everybody's the same, then there's a much worse chance of there being any kind of individuals with traits that will help it survive and reproduce, and thus permeate the species and allow it to keep living and keep the population alive. If everybody's the same, then that environmental disruption, whatever it might be, or the change in the environment is going to more likely than not wipe out the population. So as I put in this bullet point here, genetically diverse populations are more resilient to environmental disruption. The more varied they are, the more likely it is that they're going to be able to withstand environmental pressure, because there's going to be some individuals with an advantageous trait. There's a higher chance of that happening if the population is more genetically diverse. As I said a couple times already, if everyone is the same, no one individual is better adapted than another. And the same thing goes for ecosystem diversity. In our last two videos, we talked about speciation and extinction, and really changes in extinction and speciation rates determine how biodiverse or how diverse an ecosystem is, how many different varieties of plants and animals or fungi are there. Okay, so ecosystem diversity plays a role in how well an ecosystem can survive as well. Okay, take these two ecosystems, for example. Here we have some kind of field. I'm not really even sure if it's a cornfield. It looks like soy, maybe, I don't know, but it's an agricultural field, right? When you're farming something, typically what do? You farm one kind of plant, okay? And a lot of the plants that are grown in fields are all genetically the same. A lot of them are just like almost like clones, okay? So they're all the same. There is next to no genetic variation within this cornfield. Okay, so if something happens, some environmental pressure changes, will the cornfield be able to adapt? Okay, will it undergo natural selection where favored individuals are going to survive and reproduce? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe with some extra human intervention, like some genetic engineering, like we talked about in the last unit, maybe that could save them. But what we have over here is called a monoculture. Okay, and critics of the current industrial agricultural system will argue that monocultures, like see a cornfield, like you have just all corn, right, is not going to be healthy for the environment. Okay, but say a rainforest where you have an astonishing variety of living things, plants, animals, fungi, everything. Okay, that ecosystem is going to be more likely, I'm going to throw that in here actually, more likely to resist environmental pressures, okay, or become more resilient to them. Okay? There's a ton of ecosystem diversity in a tropical rainforest, but not necessarily in a cornfield. So which one might be more at risk for an environmental change? Well, one would say the monoculture in the cornfield, okay, because there's much less diversity between the organisms in this ecosystem than there are in the rainforest. Okay, the rainforest, there's going to be there's a higher chance of there being some species that are going to be better adapted to an environmental change than over here. All right, that's really one of the points that I wanted to make. A couple more points about crops. Okay, crops, like we saw before, that monoculture, crops have been more susceptible to diseases because of a lack of genetic diversity, because of monocultures. That tends to happen where, you know, there's been events in human history like the potato famine, the Irish potato famine. It really happened because there was a blight in potatoes. There was a fungus that affected all the potatoes, and since all the potato plants were all the same, there was no genetic diversity there. No potatoes were able to survive the potato blight, this fungal disease that wiped out all these potatoes, and people went hungry. It was a huge, huge deal. Corn rust is something that people battle all across the world. And some argue that it is because of the lack of genetic diversity in corn or in maize that this corn rust remains an issue, because there has not been enough natural selection occurring, and there has not been enough genetic variation. Okay, so in summary, the more genetic diversity the population has, the better. It's going to be better. The more genetic diversity the population has, or an ecosystem has, the better it will be to adapt to environmental changes. okay, is going to be able to better do natural selection and thus survive. All right, that's it for this video. Let me know if you have any questions. We will see you next time.